Now, the other thing I want to say about Medicare for All, which we tried to get through to Bernie Sanders, but without success, obviously, is I see it as a highly deflationary event. So right now I see, I'll just use very, very round numbers, but $3 trillion spent on healthcare. Out of that, $1 trillion in the private sector is private sector administration. That's pretty much going to go away if we go Medicare for All. But what does that mean if that spending goes away? Well, all those were all salaries going to, people who were like digging one hole and filling in another, which is what private sector, compared with, well, let's just say they were doing all the administration work. I'm not saying what they were doing wasn't valuable in its context, but the context had no value. But anyway, you had $1 trillion worth of wages and salaries going to people doing administration that aren't going to be there anymore. That's a highly deflationary event. All those people are going to be out of work in the unemployment lines looking for jobs. You don't raise taxes in that context. That makes no sense at all. You'd want to lower taxes or increase public spending somewhere else in that context. Now, yes, there will be other people spending more money to make up for it. Corporations will have lower healthcare costs, so they may be spending more on something else. People may be getting higher salaries. People will be, have lower healthcare costs. There won't be any healthcare premiums if it's Medicare for All, very little. Maybe you get a little bit of Part B or something. But and so there will be some inflationary biases, but I think the deflationary bias, at least initially, will dominate. So there's absolutely no reason to pay for Medicare for All with a tax increase like the Sanders campaign was putting out there. And it was a horrible tax. It was a regressive, punishing tax, even though it was supposedly on higher incomes. And the whole thing was, would have been led to, I think, 15 or 20% unemployment. I was like just categorically against that, raising taxes into a. Now that I'm thinking back on the taxes, they attempted it to be progressive, so I give them credit for that. But it would have wound up increasing unemployment, which is always a regressive phenomenon, dramatically. And it didn't have to be. And think of how much stronger the campaign would have been explaining it. Look, this is a deflationary event. You don't raise taxes for that. You don't pay for it that way. Okay. And you say, well, what about the deficit? You say, look, the public debt are the dollars spent by government that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. They sit in the accounts at the Fed called Treasury securities. What's the problem? While in the year 2030, the CBO reports the deficit's going to be $77 trillion in 20 years. They say, look, if the only problem a deficit spending can cause is inflation. So what you do is you look to the long-term inflation forecast, and they'll tell you if you have a deficit problem. Well, the long-term inflation forecasts are the CBO says 2%, the Fed says 2%, and your precious free market Treasury index bonds say something less than 2%. Okay, and I don't think 2% is an inflation problem. So what they're telling us is that even with today's budgets, even without making any adjustments at all, we're not going to have an inflation problem, which means somehow, so look, the burden of proof, if you think there's a deficit problem, the burden of proof is on you to show me there's an inflation problem. And so the burden of proof is on you to show me that the Fed, the CBO, and the free market is wrong with their inflation forecast. And if you can do that, fine, then I'll listen to you and take a look at whether or not we have a deficit problem. Okay, but he couldn't do that either. And so those were the two answers to any possible question on the public debt. It's just the dollars spent that haven't been used to pay taxes. It sits in accounts. What's the problem? And if there's, if there's no long-term deficit problem, even though the headline left, like Krugman and Reich, all these guys concede there's a headline deficit problem, they're wrong. The burden of proof is on them to show me that there's a long-term inflation problem, which means the Fed, the CBO, and the market is wrong. And until then, I don't see a long-term deficit problem. Anyway, they couldn't do that. And so we have what we have.